Next, we move to the topic of Huawei. The first question, yeah. Boris Johnson's government is conducting a new review of Huawei's role in the UK's 5G network. So what has made the Prime Minister to do such a new review? What is its purpose?
I think a number of factors are behind it. First of all, even when he proposed the deal back in, I think, January or February with Huawei, there was even at that stage a huge groundswell of opposition, particularly from his own party, from backbench members of Parliament from the Conservative Party, including the former leader of the Conservative Party, Ian Duncan Smith, the former Deputy Prime Minister Damian Green, former cabinet ministers like David Davis and others, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Tom Tugendhat, the chair of the Defence Committee, Tobias Ellwood, and others. And so even then, there was huge opposition. That opposition has only grown because of COVID-19, because we have seen the sheer danger that the CCP is, not just to its own people, but to the whole world. The CCP is a threat to the world, and people know that Huawei is not just some ordinary corporation. I mean, if it was a company in an open democratic country, if it was Ericsson or Nokia or a truly independent corporation that is separate from its government, it would be an entirely different matter. But we know that Huawei is closely aligned to the CCP. We know that Huawei has been complicit, has been actively working with the CCP to build the world's worst surveillance state, particularly in Xinjiang, the surveillance apparatus that is there, that is part of the repression of the Uyghurs, but also surveillance in other parts of China as well. And we know that the Chinese constitution, even if Huawei's intentions were not so dangerous, or even if their relationship with the CCP was at more of a distance, which I don't believe it is, but if it was, the Chinese constitution itself requires Chinese companies to share information with the CCP. So we know that Huawei is complicit with human rights violations, serious human rights violations, grave human rights violations in China, but also that it is potentially a real threat to our national security. Those arguments were made previously earlier this year, and the Prime Minister and the government decided to go ahead anyway. But I think they realize, having seen the pandemic and having seen the wave of very justified awakening among many people to the dangers of the CCP, that firstly, I don't think they could get the legislation through now. I think opposition in Parliament is so strong that they realize that there's a high chance they could be defeated, and that's one reason for carrying out the review. But perhaps also there are people at the top of government who actually are waking up to the fact that Huawei would be a real danger. And one last point that I hope is also a factor in the Prime Minister's thinking, and it should have been a factor much earlier on, is that some of our closest allies, our most traditional friends in the world, the United States, Canada, Australia, France, have to varying degrees expressed their opposition and their deep concerns about Huawei. And the United States went so far as to say that this Huawei deal could call into question the UK's intelligence sharing relationship with the United States. It could call into question some of our potential trade deals. And the Five Eyes group of intelligence allies, the US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the UK, most of the other Five Eyes members in that intelligence sharing partnership have expressed grave doubts about and concerns about Huawei. So I think all of those factors will have been weighing on the Prime Minister, and maybe also, I'm speculating here, but maybe his brush with death, his close encounter with severe illness from COVID-19. Maybe that also gave him some pause for thought and some reflection on the dangers of the CCP.
So what would be the goal of this review?
I think that's to be seen, and we'll await more announcements from the government. But I mean, there's no point in having a review really if it's going to come out with the same decision. So I hope that this review is a kind of face-saving diplomatic way of climbing down, and that the review will come out with the truth that Huawei is a threat to our national security. It's complicit with mass atrocities and grave human rights violations in China, and that, you know, if we have to choose between our closest, most traditional allies like the United States and Australia and the CCP, surely we should always be standing with the United States and Australia and other close friends. And so if that's what comes out of the review, then the next step, very obviously, would be to drop this Huawei deal completely. There is, of course, the added complication of the fact that Huawei is already in some of our telecommunication systems already. And to be fair to the government, and I'm certainly not an expert on any of the technology, that may be more difficult to disentangle, and it may be not possible or certainly difficult to change that. But what we can certainly do is stop giving Huawei even greater access, particularly to 5G. And so I hope the result of the review will be to drop Huawei, to say no way to Huawei.
So that's something, say, like taking the governmental perspective, yeah. So as a human rights activist, how does Huawei concern you particularly?
Well, it particularly concerns me for the reasons that I've already described, which is that it has, and these are not, this is not my speculation. There are statements from Huawei and from Chinese government officials saying that Huawei has worked, for example, with the Public Security Bureau to develop what they call smarter policing, which is a euphemism for greater repression. Huawei has been involved in providing the surveillance, the architecture and equipment for the surveillance operation in Xinjiang, which is part of what is arguably a cultural genocide against the Uyghurs, and certainly some of the 21st century's worst mass atrocities. And I suspect that Huawei, is also involved in surveillance throughout the rest of the country, which has resulted in serious human rights violations. So Huawei should not only be regarded from the national security point of view or from the point of view of our relationships with our closest allies. It should also be viewed with a human rights lens on. And, Ian Duncan Smith, the former leader of the Conservative Party, said very powerfully in a debate in the House of Commons on Huawei at the beginning of this year that if somebody in the 1930s were to propose that the UK do a deal with a telecommunications company, giving them access to our telecommunications network and infrastructure, and that company was a German company in Nazi Germany that had provided the surveillance equipment at Auschwitz and at other concentration camps during the Holocaust, would we have signed such a deal? And the answer is, of course, we would never have signed such a deal. If during the height of the Cold War, it was proposed that we do a deal with a Russian telecommunications company, not that, these are hypothetical examples, but and that Russian telecommunications company had been complicit with the surveillance in Stalin's Gulag, would we have done it? Of course we wouldn't. So why are we even considering a Chinese company that is so complicit with at least the architecture? I'm not saying they're carrying out themselves direct human rights violations, but they're facilitating or helping to facilitate serious human rights violations in Xinjiang and potentially in other parts of China. And that's why, as a human rights activist, I I think the idea of any deal with Huawei is both mad from our own self-interest point of view, but also totally immoral.
And wonder whether you have heard about the CCP using internet firewall, facial, voice, mood identifications, artificial intelligence, and big data to conduct censorship and surveillance of its citizens. So, if so, what's your comment?
Yes, I'm extremely aware of that, and I think that one of the many things that the international community should be trying to find ways to do is to scale the Great Firewall of China. Just as an aside, I once slept on the real Great Wall of China, on the wall itself under the stars one night with some friends, and that was a magical experience. But the Great Firewall of China, just as the Great Wall of China, with its original purpose, has been built to cut Chinese people off from the rest of the world, and to keep information and ideas and communication from the outside world either out, or at least very strictly censored and restricted. And so, again, from a human rights point of view, but also from the point of view of our relations with the Chinese people, because, as I've said in previous episodes, our problem is not with the Chinese people. The Chinese people, insofar as one can generalize about a people, are a wonderful people. China is a great ancient civilization that deserves respect and should be celebrated for what it has given to the world throughout history. Our problem is the Chinese Communist Party regime, and the Great Firewall, the internet censorship, other forms of censorship as well, are creating a communications barrier between ordinary people in China who deserve the right to have access to the free flow of ideas and information. And ultimately, I would say that there's been a lot made of China's great economic transition in recent years, and there's validity to that. Of course, China has made truly extraordinary strides economically in recent years, but ultimately economic success depends on freedom, the free flow of ideas, the freedom to be entrepreneurial, the freedom to engage with new creative ideas. And if people's minds are being stifled and controlled, and their access to information and ideas is being restricted and limited, then ultimately China's economic success will hit a brick wall, because there will come a point where the creativity, the innovation that goes with a free society will come to a halt under the CCP regime. So for all those reasons, I think the international community should be working hard to try to find ways to break through the firewall, or to scale the firewall. And I'm not enough of a technology expert. In fact, I know very little about technology except that I use it. But if there are ways to break through those barriers, to get information into China, to let Chinese people know the truth about the regime that is repressing them. I'm sure they know some of the truth, but there may be things that they don't know because they're kept from them. And if we can scale that barrier, that cyber barrier, and get information in to the Chinese people, that would be a very valuable contribution to make.
Yeah. In the past few weeks, Trump administration has imposed new restrictions on Huawei. How would such moves affect the UK policy towards Huawei?
Yes, I think that may be another factor in the Prime Minister's decision to have a review, because our relations with the United States, we have what we've always described as a special relationship. They are our closest ally. And, whatever people think of the current incumbent of the presidency, it's not about the individual or his character. It's about the friendship and the relationship between our two governments as a whole, whatever political party they are, and between our two peoples and the values that we hold in common. And anything that undermines that special relationship, I think, is extremely worrying. Of course, in a special relationship, I'm not saying we always have to agree with them, and there have been over the years perfectly legitimate disagreements over different aspects of policy, and even two leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who were as close as any two leaders could be. They had their arguments, they had their disagreements. So I'm not saying we have to do everything Washington says, but on something as fundamental as Huawei, where the threats to our national security and our reputation and integrity in themselves are so clear, and where President Trump has made it clear that going ahead with this deal would seriously undermine, not just in symbolic ways, but potentially in very damaging ways to us, our deals and our agreements with the United States, economic deals, but also, most importantly, national security related arrangements, intelligence sharing arrangements, and other interactions. He's made it clear that could call those into, and that surely is a reason to give the Prime Minister and the government reason to rethink, and so perhaps that's another reason why he's having this review.
And how can the UK protect its advanced technology from being predatorily acquired by the CCP? There is a case, maybe you are aware, that it said this British technology companies, Imagination Technologies, was supposed to be removed from the UK to China. So because it was bought by a private equity, which was backed by the Chinese state-owned companies. So how do you think the UK should protect its say like the technology jewel from the CCP's predation?
Yes, I know this is something that the Foreign Affairs Committee, chaired by Tom Tugendhat, has been looking at. I believe I saw in the news that Tom Tugendhat had said that the committee was calling in witnesses and evidence to examine this, and it's clearly a big concern. My area of expertise doesn't give me enough expertise really to comment on how we do this, but that it's important is absolutely not in doubt. And you know, I think we're waking up, but we may be waking up rather too late. I hope it's not completely too late, but over the years we have already sold off to the Chinese Communist Party too many of our prized industries and actually sectors that have implications for national security. I don't know what went through people's minds when we allowed the Chinese regime to buy British steel. I don't know what people in Downing Street and government were thinking when they allowed China to invest in a nuclear reactor in Hinkley Point. To be allowing the CCP access to our nuclear energy, to our steel production, and now to other areas of technology, it just seems madness. So yes, we should absolutely be doing what we can to protect what you describe as our jewels in our economy, and particularly in sectors that are sensitive, that have potentially security implications. I'm not a protectionist. I don't want the UK to go down the path of protectionism, but we have to be sensible. You know, someone once said to me that the CCP would, if it could, buy up everything in the UK. They've already bought up British Steel. They tried to buy Buckingham Palace if they could. and there are some in the British government that would be prepared to sell it to them. And I think we have to stand up and wake up and do what we can to protect our critical industries, not from a protectionist point of view economically, but from a security point of view.
What else would you like to say about Huawei and relevant issues?
I think I would just say that I don't know why it's taken so long to even get the British government to go for a review. And as I say, I hope that's the first step towards a sort of face-saving diplomatic climb down. But it shouldn't have come to this. We should have put our relationships with our traditional allies, our moral values and concern for human rights, and most of all our concern for national security at the very heart of our decision-making process. And no matter what cabinet ministers say in terms of reassurances, I'm not convinced that they really did, because even when they announced the deal, they announced that they were reducing by some percent the percentage of the stake that Huawei would have in the 5G infrastructure. They acknowledged explicitly that there were legitimate concerns, and that's why they were reducing the size of Huawei's involvement. Well, if there are legitimate concerns about national security, why are we doing the deal at all? And the idea that there was no alternative, again, I'm not a technology expert by any means, but surely there were companies like Nokia, like Ericsson, like some American companies who were not far off being able to provide the alternative. Maybe we'd have had to have waited a little longer. Maybe we would have had to pay a little bit more for it. But those would have been better and prices worth paying, rather than sacrificing our national security, our moral integrity, and our allies with our closest friends. And so I hope now that even though it's long overdue, I hope we say no way to Huawei.
Thank you very much, Ben. It's a brilliant Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.